I give now the floor to José Ramón. I will briefly introduce him. He's an historian of science and professor at the López Piñero Inter-University Institute in Valencia. He's leading at the present project Toxic Spain, Experts, Activists and Regulations during the 20th Century. As most of you will know, he has published widely on the history of science education, chemistry textbooks, scientific popularization, material culture of science in 19th century France and Spain. And during the last decade, his research has focused on the history of toxicology and forensic medicine of the 19th and 20th century. His last two books are Tóxicos, Pasado y Presente from 2021 on the history of toxic regulations, and before that, a biography of the famous Spanish-French toxicologist Mateo Orfila. José Ramón, I will give the floor now to you, and you will share your presentation with us.
Thank you very much, Ernst. Thank you very much to the organizers of this session for inviting me. I would like to share with you some thoughts about the questions posed by the organizers. First of all, I would like to say something about the history of chemistry. Then I would like to mention some of the new trends, and then I will discuss some of my current work with you. Particularly, I would like to offer you some ideas about the narrative audiences I'm trying to address. So very quickly, just let me remind you that the 19th century chemistry historians created a very powerful narrative centered around a select group of male protagonists, specific problems, sources, and locations. And this group of books on history of chemistry were predominantly written by chemists and primarily intended for a chemical audience, including academic chemists, industrial chemists, chemistry teachers, students of chemistry. And this group of people, these chemist historians, created a master narrative of progress and modernity by means of chemistry, which is nowadays found in popular textbooks and prevalent in celebratory practices, in mass media, in science museums, and science journalism. Of course, new trends emerged since the early 20th century, and during the second half of the 20th century, you have dramatic transformations with the works of Thomas Kuhn, Michel Foucault, the development of the science studies, the strong program of social science in the 70s, and the so-called socio-constructivists in the 90s, and the new studies on science and gender. All these and other trends introduce a radical change in history of science. And again, history of chemistry was at the very center of these historiographical turns in areas such as the laboratory studies, the study of material and visual culture, gender studies, science in the public culture, or the circulation of knowledge. Let me just mention, when talking about the spatial turn, the project Sites of Chemistry, run by Antonio García Belmar and the late John Perkins, who unfortunately passed away some weeks ago, whose work mapping French chemical labs inspired many other similar studies, including my studies on 19th century toxicology. Considering all these significant transformations occurred in the last decades, how challenging is to address the question posed by the organizers regarding the position of the history of chemistry among other academic disciplines in the early 21st century. In the current scholarly landscape, we, historians of chemistry, operate within a very interdisciplinary context, working in a fluid dialogue with other fields such as STS studies, philosophy of chemistry, history of medicine, history of technology, environmental history, economic history. And we just need to pay attention to the last issues of AMBIS. For instance, this special issue on women in chemistry, dialoguing with studies on science and gender, this other issue on alchemical practice and chemical humanities, growing in this interdisciplinary area, which encompasses fields such as philosophy of chemistry, ethics of chemistry, and communication studies, similar as in the field of history of medicine, the area of medical humanities involving interaction between history and areas as bioethics, philosophy of medicine, and translational medicine. And this last issue from February 2023 on environmental history of alchemy, which is close related to my work on poison. During the last 2 decades, as Ernst mentioned, my research was focused on the history of poison and toxicology, first in 19th century France, paying attention to the role of forensic doctors and toxicologists in poisoning trials, particularly those perpetrated by women. Thus, my work was related to legal history, studies on experts, and history of medicine, particularly the history of autopsies and animal experiments. During the last years, I moved from history of 19th century toxicology to the history of toxic products in 20th century. And I discussed issues as food poisoning, asbestos industry, industrial workplace hazards, or the pesticide industry. I wrote this book mentioned by Ernst, in which I review the recent literature on history of toxic products, including all these different group of issues, from oil spills, industry leaks, nuclear hazards, mining, agriculture, food quality, public health problems, water, soil, air contamination, and so on. I have published several papers on lead poisons, but my most recent work is about the history of pesticide industry in Spain, including issues coming from environmental history, but also history of public health and occupational medicine, and the history of industrial and the toxic products, as the book edited by Ernst Homburg and Elizabeth Boppel, or was coming from historian of agriculture or history of pesticide industry, as the recent work by Adam Romero on economic poisons, on recent studies on DDT, as well as recent scholarship on science as fascism. My work is on the early Francoist regime in Spain, so I'm interested in studies on Nazi Germany or fascist Italy. I'm also interested in recent studies on agnotology and ignorance studies. I am now editing with other colleagues a collective book on the making of ignorance in 20th century Spain in different fields, from agriculture, pesticide industry, to nuclear energy, water quality, mining, popular science, and climate change. So my work is closely connected to recent scholarships on ignorant studies. So as you can see, I'm working in a very interdisciplinary toxic atmosphere, dialoguing not only with other academic groups, but also with victims associations and activists. Let me finish my presentation with some words about my sources and intended audiences. I regard toxic products as both political and material entities, embedded and sometimes producing an unequal balance of costs and benefits. While their production and commercialization bring huge profits for the polluters, their human and environmental costs are usually left to the state welfare systems or turned into a toxic burden for marginalized groups. Toxic exposure can be regarded as a form of slow violence, and it affects mostly marginalized communities who lack the necessary resources to make this damage visible. This situation affects the role of historians, because we know that the chemical industry has developed large campaigns for deceit and denial, for creating doubts about the environmental and health problems created by chemical products. Just think about the asbestos industry or the oil industry concerning climate change. The available sources are unbalanced and biased. We have limited access to the industry archives, except when they are obliged by legal sentences, as the tobacco industry. And the voice of the victims is usually misrepresented or neglected in official archives. So when possible, we, historians of the toxic world, need to use other sources, literary sources, mass media, or oral history. And we need to be also active in the making and preservation of archives related to history of the toxic world, not only those related to big name, big toxicologies, as Matteo Orfila, as was mentioned before, but also to the archive of the industry and the archive of the activist groups. And another additional challenge for this kind of history is our audience. With our publication, exhibition, and seminars, we want to address not only academic or professional audiences, chemists or historians, but also general audiences, including concerned citizens interested in the regulation of toxic products. And for these new publics, we need to explore new narratives and media. Let me just offer 2 examples of my recent work.
Can you briefly?
Yeah, I'm finished.
Just this, and then
I'm coming to the end. This last, the last 2.
Okay, thank you.
One of these examples is this book with several trials, positional trials from late Middle Age to the 20th century, and the other project I'm running is this blog with a textbook on general history of science, medicine, and technology addressed to the general public. I think that is my conclusion, that we need, in order to discuss the future of a history of chemistry, we need to discuss all these ingredients I mentioned before, but particularly the problem of the audiences. My feeling is that much more work is needed in that way for enlarging the audiences of history of chemistry, and particularly for attracting the interest of general audiences to our area. Thank you.
Thank you very much, José Ramón. In 2 years' time, we will have the International Conference on History of Chemistry in Valencia, and I'm sure topics you address now will also play a role in that conference. Okay, now I welcome Paulina as the second speaker. We have a general discussion after the first 3 speakers with their different perspectives. Paulina Sophie Gennermann is a historian of science and a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute for the History of Ethics of Medicine at Heidelberg University. She finished her PhD at Bielefeld Graduate School in History and Sociology in March 2023. Her dissertation, Eine Geschichte mit Geschmack, studied the nature of artificial flavorings and their industrial production in the 20th century. Using the example of vanillin, Paulina holds a master's degree in the history, economics, and philosophy of science from University of Bielefeld, and a French-German bachelor in history generally from the University of Bielefeld and the Université Paris Diderot. Paulina, the floor is yours. Could you remove your PowerPoint, José Ramón, or stop this screen sharing? And I think then, Paulina, do you have a PowerPoint? Or
no,
you
I don't
without?
have one. I have without. I'm without.
Okay, but it's good maybe, Victoria, you have a PowerPoint maybe? No, okay, well, then we can leave this interesting slide on the future of the history also in view. Paulina, the floor is yours.
Sorry.
Yeah, okay, thank you for the short introduction. I would like to think about the contributions of the history of chemistry to historical studies of science, industry, and society, and to ongoing debates of the 21st century from a history of flavors and fragrance perspective, and I will focus on food flavors. My main argument of today is that history of chemistry might be a suitable tool to bridge the often perceived gap between chemistry, chemical industry, and society. During my PhD, I analyzed the nature of synthetic and artificial flavoring agents with a special emphasis on vanillin. And in my opinion, it is important to study chemical substances that are omnipresent in our daily lives and routines in order to understand the industry producing them and their effects on us. And flavors and fragrances do have a strong impact on our culture, on our behavior, and on our physiology. In my short talk today, I focus on one of the most important and, in my opinion, most interesting questions coming to mind when studying flavors, the question of naturalness. Flavors are ideal objects of inquiry for an analysis of the perception and understanding and the development of the terms natural, synthetic, artificial, and chemical. But why is that important? These terms were and are used a lot in the 20th and 21st century, but they have very different and various meanings. Everyone using these terms can have his or her personal understanding. Studying the past may clarify today's understandings and usages and may help to explain potential misunderstandings or other difficulties. Let me give you a short example. In the 20th century, industry differentiated between 3 different types of flavors. And as this classification was used by politics for regulation as well, it was a widely used classification. There were natural, synthetic, and artificial flavors. Natural flavors were occurring in nature and directly got from nature by extraction or distillation. Synthetic flavors were produced by chemical synthesis, but their chemical structure occurs in nature. They were and are identical in their chemical structure to natural ones, just the production process and the raw materials were different. And there were artificial flavors, which were produced by chemical synthesis and not known to occur in nature. These definitions rely on chemical knowledge, primarily on chemical structure. Using this understanding as the starting point, it has to be said that the interpretation and the perceived value of these 3 flavor types varied. This can be very well illustrated by comparing industry and consumers' perspective. While chemists and chemical industry put synthetic and natural flavors close to each other, for them synthetic basically was natural, and understood artificial flavors as something a bit more particular, the consumers had a totally different perception. For them, the category natural was something special and of high value, while synthetic and artificial were both closely linked to chemical industry, industrial production, and something non-natural. Long story short, industries and consumers' perspective were the exact opposite due to different approaches to the terms. That this phenomenon induced some misunderstandings, difficulties regarding the perception of food ingredients and the regulation of flavors, and a sort of alienation and even mistrust might be obvious. Without going into detail about the characteristics of these problems, I want to talk about the function and the value of the history of chemistry at this point. History of chemistry might offer a bridge between the different perspectives. By analyzing the development of the terms and by studying the different possible points of view, history of chemistry helps to explain the differences, to decipher, not to solve, but to decipher misunderstandings, prejudices, and critiques of the past and the present. And in doing so, history of chemistry might also highlight further objects in terms of future inquiry. For example, the legal terms of flavors used in Germany changed during the 21st century. Today, there is no more the declaration artificial or nature identical, as synthetic flavors were called, now we have in Germany, for example, 2 types of natural flavors. So the story continues, and there's a lot of work to do for the history of chemistry. In this area of research, and this is not particular for history of chemistry and not for history of flavors and fragrances, it is important to not being guided by personal opinions, preferences, and perceptions. And I say that because working on terms like natural and chemical, there are up-to-date discussions and everyone is in a certain way personally involved. So the researcher really needs to focus on studying the topic from the different perspectives equally to show entanglements and interrelations from all sides without or with the least judgment as possible. And this means not only to look for the responsibilities of industry or politics, but also to investigate the responsibilities of consumers and of society in general. In any case, there won't be a straightforward or clear-cut answer, but the presentation and the investigation of a very complex network. History of chemistry enables us, in cooperation with other historical studies like industrial, economic, and cultural history, to do this research and to bridge big gaps between chemistry, industry, and society. So that's my input for today. I hope you found it interesting.
Thank you very much. Also for keeping so well the time in mind. This is very good. Doesn't happen always. The discussion after the 3 talks is, of course, very important. I ask everybody to either to put remarks in the chat box or later wave hands, and I will try to moderate that as far as I can. We move now to the 3rd speaker. So thank you again, Paulina. And I introduce now briefly Victoria Lee, who is Associate Professor in the History Department at University of Ohio. She's historian of modern science and technology with a focus on the role of Japan in the 20th and 21st centuries. In 2021, she published a book, The Art of the Microbial World, Fermentation, Science in 20th Century Japan, which looks at Japanese society's engagement with microbes in science, industry, and environmental management. Victoria holds a PhD from Princeton and was previously a postdoctoral fellow at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin, and a fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Paris. Her work has appeared in a variety of journals and edited collections, and she has also written for a wider audience. Please, Victoria, start your talk. We are very curious, and after that, we will start our discussion.
Thanks so much. When headlines talk about sustainability now, chemistry is often the bad guy, as we've heard about in the last 2 talks. And you have the petrochemical industry as part of the Anthropocene's great acceleration since 1945. You have the application of chemical inputs, so-called chemical inputs, or fertilizers and pesticides in industrial agriculture, the production of plastics. These are the very products, say in the 1950s, that were a symbol of the achievements of modernity and quality of life. And now they're being blamed as causes of climate change and ecological damage. While biological industry, that is making chemicals using biological processes, is often pitched as a sustainable alternative. For example, culturing protein from cells to lower meat consumption, or applying biofertilizers in agriculture to have a more ecologically healthy impact on the soil, or even growing algae. For example, the Japanese company Chitose has set up the world's largest plant for cultivating local algae in Borneo in Malaysia. The algae eat carbon dioxide, absorb carbon dioxide from a coal electricity generation plant to grow through photosynthesis. And then the algae are used as a resource to make paper, biofuels, plastics, cosmetics. And the scientists involved say that all the consumer products that are made from oil that our society relies on can actually be made from algae, thereby reducing the product's carbon footprint and contributing to sustainability. There's soft chemistry or green chemistry as a whole, having questions like, can we use biological processes like fermentation that take place at ambient pressure and ambient temperature and don't require large volumes of toxic catalysts to replace large-scale industrial processes with more environmentally friendly alternatives? Headlines highlight these biological solutions as new alternatives to problems caused by the chemical industry. But I argue that by looking at biological industries, we can explore a much deeper and longer history of the idea that inspiration from biology and nature can revolutionize synthetic industrial chemistry, or the science of making things. And this is what I look at in my recent book by building on the work of historians such as Robert Budd, looking at biological industries that synthesize chemicals, from fermentation in the 1900s through to antibiotics in the 1950s to pharmaceuticals and biotech in the 1980s. And here today, I'd like to address the perspective that my work offers on two questions about our discipline. So first, what does a focus on the chemical industry offer the history of biology? And second, what does a focus on biology offer the history of chemical industry? So I'll start with the first one. How might chemistry contribute to the history of biology? It gives us an alternative genealogy of the 20th century, where Darwin and Mendel are not the starting points, where a history of biotechnology is not the rise of medical bacteriology in the late 19th century, followed by microbial genetics in the mid-20th century, finally the rise of recombinant DNA in the 1970s. But rather, following fermentation science shows us a different trajectory of biology based on making chemicals, focused on creating and shaping the political economy of everyday life. So for one example, from the 1950s to the 1970s, scientists in Japanese corporate laboratories started to ferment MSG, monosodium glutamate. This is a flavor product that's based on glutamic acid, which is an amino acid. It's one of the building blocks of proteins and found in our bodies. So instead of making monosodium glutamate by acid hydrolysis of protein, they used fermentation, which made the process much cheaper. They also started at the same time, 1950s to 1970s, to ferment new flavors, including IMP and GMP. These are nucleotides, or the building blocks of nucleic acids, like DNA and RNA. MSG, which is based on the amino acid glutamic acid, causes a particular umami flavor. That's a deliciousness flavor. When you put it on your tongue, there are sensors for that. And MSG has the umami flavor of seaweed, whereas the nucleotide IMP, or inosinic acid, causes the umami flavor of dried fish flakes. In Japanese, they're called katsuobushi, and you put them on top of noodles and things. And it's a kind of distinctive flavor product. And the nucleotide GMP, or guanylic acid, causes yet another umami flavor, or deliciousness flavor. It causes the flavor of shiitake mushrooms. These are all different kinds of flavors that you can make with amino acids and nucleotides. But elsewhere at the same time, in Europe and America, these same materials, amino acids and nucleotides, were under study in molecular biology for a very different reason, for their cellular roles in gene replication, in protein synthesis, that is, for how organisms reproduce through DNA, how genes become organisms through these DNA and RNA nucleic acid codes being translated into amino acids that in turn make up proteins. And this is around the very same period when Watson and Crick published their double helical model of DNA structure. In Japan, instead of investigating amino acids and nucleotides as answers to the secret of life, how organisms reproduce, fermentation scientists studied them in these corporate labs for how they tasted in order to be able to make these amino acids and nucleotides industrially. This work in Japan, it represented an emphasis on a form of craft knowledge or procedural knowledge, knowing how versus knowing that. Scientists were more interested in making the microbe do something to make what they wanted it to make than in figuring out the genetic basis of what the microbe was. And this trajectory of microbiology in Japan, going from brewing to antibiotics to this, what they called metabolic engineering here, it's a contrast to the more familiar path of modern microbial biology in most of Europe and America, from medical bacteriology in the early 20th century to bacterial genetics at mid-century to genetic engineering in the late 20th century. And overall, there's a pluralism in science that it's possible to recover from this history. It's a different set of scientific questions, values, and contributions to knowledge that resulted from seeing microbes as productive. And focusing on fermentation science, we've got a story of biology where the main line is not centered on structural biology in this period, like using crystallography to understand the chemical structure of living molecules like DNA, but one focused on manipulating properties of cellular metabolism. So it's more like the kind of biology behind the 2015 Nobel Prize in Medicine for the discovery of the antiparasitic drug.
Could you round it up in a minute or so?
Yeah, sure. I thought I had 10 minutes, but
yeah, but
I can round it up.
I thought you were about 10 minutes, but maybe I made a mistake. What was your idea about it?
Okay, I think I've been about 7 so far, 6 or 7.
Well. 2 minutes,
yeah,
2 minutes more, yes?
I'll try to condense it a little bit. So it's a contrast to the kind of biology that we traditionally focus on when we look at histories of biology in the 20th century. The second question that I want to address quickly, what might the life sciences offer the history of chemical industry? In current discussions of sustainability, some commentators, such as Jamie Lorimer, have evoked the idea that we live in an antibiotic world, too focused on control and elimination of life using heavy-handed chemical techniques. Like antibiotics. And instead, we need a new paradigm that's more focused on interdependence than control, using biological techniques or so-called probiotic approach. I argue that the history of biological industries like fermentation shows us that it's not new to work at a large-scale industrial level while valuing interdependence. For example, screening, which is the technique that was used to discover ivermectin. It's this anti-parasitic drug that won scientists the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 2015. It was discovered by a process of isolating microbial strains, collecting strains, culturing strains, studying strains, and eventually selecting the best strain for doing one envisioned function. So this is what Omura Satoshi did. He went out, he isolated the strain, which he collected from the soil of a golf course, and he identified it among thousands of other strains as a strain that could do something special. No other strain of the same species, nor any other strain that produces ivermectin has been reported to have been isolated since. Omura Satoshi had a
background. Could you wind up
and
can you end with the conclusion, Victoria?
Yeah, so these are the classic skills of fermentation science. They have direct continuities with traditional industry, with sake and soy sauce brewing. And so current industrial biochemistry, traditional techniques of fermentation overlap. We have a science that values working with microbes and not against them, that values our interdependence with them. So it's valuable to recognize the history of chemistry as a separate field, in that it allows us to shift perspective in the history of biology. We can write a different genealogy of 20th century biology that's no less important than the traditional story that produced discoveries like antibiotics and CRISPR gene editing technology.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Victoria. Yeah. I think my first question goes to the other speakers, to each of the 3 speakers, and in the meantime, I look if there are other reactions. And that is, if you want to react on one of the other 2 stories. I first ask José Ramón, do you want to react to one of the two other stories, or just we open the floor for other people? Briefly react.
I would like just to say that these stories are just showing the connection with many other fields.
Absolutely.
With history of biology or history of sense, history of flavor, that in which we are working now as historians of chemistry. So it's remarked this interdisciplinary context I was mentioning.
And the role of the consumer and the audiences, it comes back everywhere. Paulina, do you want to react on one of the two other stories you heard? Briefly?
At the moment, not. I will open the floor for everyone, but I would like to say that I love the topics and I'm very curious to hear more about that.
And you, Victoria, you like to react on one of the other two talks?
Yeah, just very quickly, José Ramón, I think the emphasis on how do we connect with a general audience about very important questions of sustainability today. That's something that I think we can draw a common thread through our talks, and also Paulina, this emphasis on what can we actually think of as artificial or natural or synthetic, and what is, there's an ethical dimension to that. What is good, what is bad, and as consumers or as scientists, we all have a responsibility to try to understand that better. So yeah, I think it's a common thread through our conversations. And I'm looking.
Okay, thank you very much. Who would like to ask a question or make a remark? So raise your hand, or I look also to the chat box, but is there someone who likes to comment? Of course, I have also my own questions, but that is only as a reserve situation. Is there anyone who I can give the floor?
I think Guillermo, that's right.
I saw him, of course. There it is. Yes, Guillermo, please put your micro on and ask the question. Yeah, and also to whom you asked the question.
Thank you, Ernst, and thank you to the speakers. The topics are indeed very interesting. And I see the connection here is that we're working on the history of chemistry, but then we see the bad reputation of chemistry and things like that, and life sciences sounds much better now. Then I'm thinking about the implications of that for the activity, for the practice of the history of chemistry. I'm wondering, my question is not about the subject of history of chemistry, but the impact of moving in the direction of the history of the life sciences. What's your opinion about the social impact of this for the activity of the history of chemistry? I mean, do you think it's better, or is this a good way to go, or not a good way? It's something like, do you think with this, it is much better, much easier to get funding, for instance, to do studies on the history of chemistry? What do you think is the implication of this?
Sorry, is this a general question to all the speakers, or
yes.
do you have one in particular?
No, for
okay, then yeah. Please close the micro. Is there one of the speakers who would like to reflect on this? To respond to this? Who can I give the floor?
I can say
José Ramón, yes.
Something very quickly. That I think that is an opportunity to establish connection with other fields like history of medicine, history of biology, and enlarging our audience in that sense. I don't know if it's a way to get funding, but probably it's a way to put some of the topics which have been discussed usually by historians of chemistry in connection with all these issues which are discussed in other areas as history of biology, history. I think this issue of natural artificial, which is an old dichotomy coming from the alchemy, and we have many studies about that. So it's an excellent idea to have all the discussion we have coming from the area of history of alchemy, of history of chemistry, and put that in connection with the history of sense, as in the case of Paulina, and the question of flavors, and also in the case of Victoria, the question of artificial or not fermentation, or artificial or natural toxic products is another interesting topic to discuss
Thank you very much. There is a question from Sarah, who's on the airport now, but which relates very close to this, because of course, very interesting. The flavors from in Paulina's talk also came back in Victoria's talk. And the question by Sarah, it's in the chat box, is whether this distinction which you see in Germany between artificial and natural and synthetic, if similar things happened in Japan, Victoria, in the 20th century, if there also this distinction between artificial and synthetic is as clear as in Germany, it plays a large role there.
I don't focus as much on the regulation side, so I'm not sure about the policy, but I do know that when it came to the consumer side, this really fluctuated in the mid-20th century. So for example, MSG, it was seen as, for a long time until the 1960s or so, it was seen as a modern chemical that was not exactly natural, but artificial in a good way. Like it could help you stimulate your brain because, it's naturally occurring, it's a neurotransmitter, and so on. But around the 1960s, 1970s, around the time when there was an environmental consumer movement picking up in Japan, then the perception of MSG really changed. And there were also studies going on in the United States about the kinds of physiological effects that it can have that were very negative, and studies going on laboratory rats as well, and that flipped people's perception to seeing MSG as bad. So the companies reoriented their marketing. So they said, well, no, we no longer make MSG by extraction. We make it from a natural way, from fermentation. We make it using exactly the same processes that are used to make sake and soy sauce and other kinds of brewing. So the companies kind of manipulated the marketing as well to interact with these environmental consumer movements and different.
So Victoria, could you say that originally there is quite a cultural difference between Japan and Germany with respect to naturalness, but that after the Second World War, especially in the 1970s, this grew more to similar perceptions as in Europe about synthetics? Is this a way to summarize it, or you see this different?
Yeah, perhaps it is, because there's more of a continuity between some of these so-called, I think they would be kind of natural. It would count as a natural flavor by the kind of classifications that Paulina was talking about. And I suppose that's how flavors like MSG were perceived in Japan, as it was there's much more of a fermentation is much larger in the Japanese diet, and there are lots of kind of seasonings that they used. So MSG was different from these kind of natural seasonings that you can get from fish flakes or whatever. But it was part of this. It was kind of a modern version that was novel in that way, like a modern convenience that was.
Thank you very much. I want to emphasize once again that the big questions in the background, and that's why all your three talks were so interesting, have to do with, okay, what is the future of the history of chemistry? Where are we? What's the directions taken? What kind of relevance will be important in the future? And also, are there lessons from the history of chemistry? And you have all talked about that for, the future of society. And so both sides were the major questions which will be addressed the 29th of September. And I look now to the audience, if there are others who want to wave the hand, who want to ask a question. If I have a question to José Ramón, if you permit me, or do you see a waving hand somewhere which I don't see?
No, sorry, I think Brigitte wrote something and as a comment, I guess, with a question.
Brigitte, do you have a question? I saw that Brigitte
I can
made a positive remark, but I wait.
Ramón, can you read my question, please?
Where is it?
Yeah, I think You say thank all the three speakers for their perspective based on extensive and original research. I love the point that history of chemistry has actually contributed more to historiography than is usually acknowledged. I think that's true with the end of the big picture at the end of the 20th century.
Obviously, I found that a very interesting part of your talk, José Ramón. And Brigitte, could you, maybe also all three speakers could say something on that, but especially you in the first place, José Ramón. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I leave the floor to the other speaker, but just let me say that I think that is a crucial issue for us, that we are historians of chemistry have been part of this deconstruction of these big pictures, but we need to be also part of the making of new narratives, which could be appealing for these general audiences, as I was saying. But I leave the floor to Victoria, Paulina.
Yeah, Paulina.
To know what they think.
Paulina, do you have a remark on Brigitte's questions?
Yeah, an idea maybe to her question of how we can convey this to our colleagues, historians. Yeah, I think one way would be, as I did with my colleagues in Vilnius, to form panels with cultural historians as well as my colleague Sophie Wagemann, for all who were there, who talked about the contraceptives. She's actually more a cultural historian. She isn't from the field of history of chemistry. So I think we need to find these points where we all can get together and just start talking and working together, and not to think in these disciplinary barriers, constraints, like we are history of chemistry. But no, of course we are doing history of chemistry, but history of chemistry involves cultural history, involves industrial history, involves economic history, even involves natural sciences. Like when I'm working on flavors and fragrances, I have a little bit to talk to chemists, for example, or to flavorists. So I think this idea of communicating outside of the own area is very important here.
Yeah, that was your important remark in your talk about bridging gaps. And indeed, very interesting what you say about Sophia. She wrote a very interesting report on the Vilnius conference. And that, yeah, for her, it was very interesting to engage also with the history of chemistry community, although she had a different background. So having these live meetings and panels is indeed very important. Victoria, would you like to respond to Brigitte's question?
Yeah, I think the history of chemistry is actually very distinctive in being at the center of these discussions today about sustainability and environmental change. And I think we can actually take advantage of that and argue about how looking at the history of chemistry can help us with the problems that we're facing right now. We can take advantage of how topical it is. So for me, for example, I'd like to argue that these traditions come from biological synthesis as well, which is part of chemistry. We have experience working, with biological concerns like interdependence, with biodiversity within the chemical industry. And we can get this from looking at the history of chemistry. So we're actually in a very special position to work with contemporary concerns along with working with other disciplines to do so.
I find that very interesting from your talk, that you also point to the fact that biologists and chemists have a kind of different philosophy of science, different ways of thinking about, and the confrontation really helps getting further and having a more inclusive and more interdependent way of looking to processes. I was very interested, José Ramón, if you permit me, about your life, your story, which you presented. Because when you worked on textbooks in the 1990s, this was hardcore history of chemistry. And you move now to politics, audiences. And then the question comes, because with the other two speakers, they started a career at a later date than you and I did. Well, I was even much further down the road, but how does that happen? Is that a question of what Guillermo asked about funding? Is that a question of having examples in your neighborhood of people who go the political direction and you see Okay, that's a very important way to do that. Or is it more a broader social issue of environmental and climate change and all kinds of social issues? Could you briefly say how did you move from the textbook to the audiences?
Yeah, very quickly, I think that is one of the issues I wanted to remark from the future of the discussion of the future of history of chemistry, is the institutional setting in which we are working, the audience we are addressing. So in my case, this was the crucial point. At the beginning, I was in a department of history of science, and then in the last 2 decades, I moved to a center in which communicating science, connecting with audiences, creating debates, producing products, address exhibitions for general audience. That is part of our job. So that this change in my institutional setting,
it was quite a natural process. Yeah,
it was that changed the way I was approaching these topics and the topics I'm discussing in my work.
I asked the same question to Paulina and Victoria. Paulina, of course, University of Bielefeld is not a typical standard German university. I mean, so maybe there is also an issue. But Victoria, I have no idea about this institutional setting in which you are working. Also, does that enhance and the interaction between disciplines? And then after you, Paulina, briefly.
Yeah, of course, I wrote my PhD in Bielefeld, and there it was a very good environment for interdisciplinary exchange, because there the doors more or less are often open, and so I could talk to chemists. I did it once because I had heavily difficulties understanding a chemical article I was reading for my dissertation. And yeah, here in Heidelberg now, I'm at the medical faculty, basically. So I'm surrounded by historians of medicine, which is not always very easy, but it helps to...
Wait a minute. I don't hear you at the moment.
I could still hear you. I hope everyone could hear what I say. So here with the historians of medicine, it contributes a lot to my own research right now, and we have a lot in common, even if it's not that obvious sometimes.
Okay, and Victoria, what's the institutional impact in your case?
I was actually hired into my institution to do interdisciplinary teaching. So I have co-taught an epistemology course called Knowing What We Know. It was for freshmen, and I co-taught it with a physicist and a philosopher for a couple of years. Right now, I'm teaching a course, an introductory course that's compulsory for all freshman engineers at my institution, and I teach about like 400 or 500 of them a year. History of technology. So it keeps me current with the kinds of concerns that scientists and engineers have, but it's also very different from research. There's a different problem from research, framing our results for students and trying to think about how we want them to change their approach, but not necessarily thinking about, what kind of knowledge do we want to add, but more like what kind of skills, what kind of analysis, what kind of approach do we want them to have? How do we want to open their minds in a way that they might not get out of their science courses or engineering courses? So it's been very good for thinking about what is the broader value of the research that I'm doing, which is another kind of interdisciplinary, and it's been very interesting for me.
Thank you very much. This is fascinating to have this discussion, but unfortunately we are running out of time, so there's only time for a few final questions, one maybe or two. Are there any final questions or remarks? If not, I have one remark to Victoria. I also worked in the history of technology for quite a while, and that really was, because that's a very broad field, so it was very productive coming from a history of chemistry background, working in the history of technology, which made it even much broader and also with other audiences. I would like to thank all the speakers for this wonderful discussion and also your presentations, especially. It was, in fact, well, so much information that's difficult to digest everything, but I hope that Sarah will enjoy this and will profit from it. And I see a remark by Candida. Is that true, Candida? Did you raise your hand?
No, I was just clapping.
Oh, you're just clapping. And Paulina, Paulina, you also were clapping, or you had? Okay. Well, then I start clapping too. Thank you very much for this wonderful discussion, and hope you will join the fourth one, which will be in 2 weeks on the 29th of June. Thank you very much. And it will be again on the normal hour of 3:00 p.m. CEST, and at all different times in the world, but that will be communicated by Sarah. And we thank Sarah very much for preparing this entire series of discussions. Hope to see you soon.
Thank you very much. See you in 2 weeks.
Yes.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.